Let's talk about bats. Figured I should start by telling you what a bat is. So a bat's not just one kind of animal. There's about 1,300 species of bats. About 1 out of every 4, out of every 5 mammals is a different kind of bat. So these are the mammals that fly. And bats live in a world of darkness, and they live in a world of sound. And this puzzled early biologists because not only can bats fly around in the dark in a forest, but they can also get around the complete darkness of a cave. So these are different species of bats in a cave, and they're all flying around, and they don't run into the walls in the cave. And there's no light in the cave. And people were trying to figure out how they did this. So this is Lazzaro Spallanzani. Let's go back to 1794. He's 65 years old at this time. He's a really established scientist. He was one of the first people to show that microbes don't spontaneously generate out of the environment, which was like cutting-edge science back then. He described tardigrades. He showed that sexual reproduction is the combination of egg and sperm. And so he was a really well-known biologist, and he kind of destroyed his legacy because he decided to take on this project of how is it that bats get around at night. So he put owls and bats in a dark room. He put wires around the room, and he reduced the light. And once it got to absolute darkness, owls crashing into everything, bats can still fly around. So he's like, that's funny. They can get around in absolute darkness. Then he did something, I don't know, he blinded the bats. A little harder to do this now with iCook, but at the time you could just do anything you want to animals, so he just poked their eyes out, and they still just flew around and avoided all of the wires. Then he did many different terrible things to them, including deafening them, and it's only when he deafened them that they started to crash into the wires, and he could not explain this. He didn't know what was going on, and so he just published a paper where he said, I think they see with their ears. And everybody laughed and thought, okay, he's senile now, and nobody took him seriously. And of course, now we know why his experiment turned out that way. And does anyone know what this? That's right. Bats have sonar. So this wasn't discovered until 1944 by Donald Griffin, actually when he was an undergraduate. He was working on this, and they had special machines for detecting ultrasound. And he brought this in a room with a bat, and the bat was producing ultrasound. And then he started studying this, and he realized that bats have sonar. Sonar was really new at the time. And in fact, the CIA investigated Donald Griffin because he seemed to have access to knowledge about sonar that was still top secret in the government at the time. And they thought he must have been getting this from the CIA or something. But nope, he had just found that bats had invented sonar way before people, and that they have a way more sophisticated kind of sonar than we have. Their sonar is still way better than anything we've developed. And sonar, in case you don't know, is sending out sound. The sounds produce echoes, and then you perceive those echoes in just the same way that we perceive light bouncing off of objects. Bats are perceiving echoes bouncing off of objects. And so they are, in fact, seen with their ears. And so I'm going to show a number of these spectrograms. So this shows frequency or pitch on the y-axis and time on the x-axis. And this is what echolocation looks like if you visualize it. So we can't hear echolocation because it's many times higher in frequency than what we can hear. So we can hear up to about 20 kilohertz. And here you can see these calls are around, going from 100 down past 50 kilohertz. So we couldn't hear these, but we can look at them in these spectrograms. And what that is a spectrogram of is a bat approaching an insect. And this is what it's like from the bat's point of view. So it's making these calls, frequency over time. You can hear they're dropping in frequency. And you can see that these calls are getting closer and closer together until it makes what's called a feeding buzz. And this is slowed down many times. Does anyone want to guess why they're getting closer and closer together? What's going on there? Anyone know? It's getting closer and closer to the insect, right? So this is what this actually looks like. And we didn't realize that bats capture insects this way until we filmed them with high-speed footage and slowed it down. This is a bat in that same kind of capture sequence you just saw. So there it is, getting closer and closer to the insect. And notice that they actually catch insects in their wings. So they use their wings as nets. That's how they catch insects. And they do this in their tail membrane and in their wing membranes. And so when we hear these feeding buzzes, it means that a bat is making a close approach to an insect like a moth. This is a moth that's been tethered. And here you can see the bat catching it in its tail membrane. Yeah. And that's actually an experiment that I'll get to about moths communicating with bats. Work done by my friends Aaron and Jesse. This is my friend Inga Geipel. She was studying how good bats' echolocation is. And in fact, they can do things that, in theory, they shouldn't be able to do. So we have these models of how echolocation works. And they're like, bats shouldn't be able to tell an insect that's right up against another object because the echoes are too close, and they shouldn't be able to do that. And so what they actually must be doing is detecting the movement or something. But that's not true, because basically what you do is you put dead dragonflies on leaves, and the bats can see the leaves. And what they do is they just change the angle of attack like this, and they can recreate an image of that insect on the leaf by approaching it from different angles. This is a bat that has really sophisticated echolocation. Does anyone want to guess what this bat eats? Look at those feet. This is a fish-eating bat. So it's flying over the surface of the water. It can detect minnow's fin protruding a few millimeters from the surface of the water. It can detect ripples on the surface of the water. It goes down, gaffs these fish with these huge claws. And then this bat is called the bulldog bat because it has these big jowls, and that's because it shoves the whole fish in its mouth and looks like this. But when it doesn't have a fish in its mouth, it looks kind of like a bulldog. So one of the really interesting things about bats is their coevolution with moths. It turns out that moths respond to the echolocation calls of bats. And I'm going to talk about work that's done by these three people who I first met as graduate students and sort of followed the story of their research during their career. They're all professors now. So we're all professors. It's kind of cool. But at the time, we're all struggling graduate students. And John Ratcliffe was trying to understand whether or not moths can jam or interfere with the echolocation calls of bats. Jesse Barber had a different hypothesis, which was that moths are making sounds, and the reason they're doing this is to warn bats that they don't taste good. And I'll tell you about who was right. So this is a bat chasing a moth, and notice that the moth is doing these evasive maneuvers. So if you play sounds of bats to moths, or in fact if you jingle your keys and make ultrasound that way, moths will just drop out of the air. They'll do these like spiral maneuvers. So they can clearly hear bat calls, and that's because they actually some moths have ears that are tuned to the echolocation frequencies of bats, and bats over evolutionary time are trying to get out of those frequencies and changing their frequency. But what we also know is that moths produce sound, like I said. And it turns out that through a series of experiments, Jesse showed that his hypothesis was actually correct, and that moths, in fact, do make these sounds to sort of train bats to say, I'm not a palatable moth. And what's interesting is that the moths will have colors for birds and they have sounds for bats. So these multimodal cues, but they're actually for different predators. But then it turns out that John Ratcliffe was actually right as well. But it wasn't until Jesse Barber's key experiment with tiger moths that actually demonstrated the fact that this long-standing hypothesis was true, that moths can jam bat sonar. This is what this looks like. So this is a tiger moth. The bat is coming up to the moth. It's echolocating. Suddenly the moth starts making this sound. And there's the bat. Misses the moth completely. It's like a phantom moth is there that it's trying to grab. And this is what this looks like in the spectrogram. This is the bat's echolocation call. There's an echo that's going to come back that's going to look like that. And then right when the bat gets close, the moth makes this sound. So a lot of clicks, really loud, right on top of the frequency band of the bats. And so it turned out that everybody was right. Moths both are warning bats, and there are other species of moths that jam bats. But it gets even better. It turns out some bats can jam other bats. When when Aaron told me about this, I actually didn't believe it. I was like, I will believe that if you can jam a bat's call with a speaker, you play the call and the bat gets all freaked out and can't navigate. And then he just did that and published it in Science. So it's true, they do it. And it's just amazing because all of these people have been seeing bats making these calls. In fact, he went through papers and said, people reporting, those are echolocation calls on the left. Then we see this weird thing, this squiggly line. I don't know. Some people just ignored them. They thought, I don't know, maybe they're talking to each other, who knows. So it turns out what's actually happening here is this bat is overlaying this squiggly call right on top of the feeding buzz of another bat, and it matches up, and it jams the bat calls. And so this is, pretty recently discovered. It also turns out that going with the theme of what we were talking about before, with plants communicating with sound, well, do they? Well, here's another way that they kind of communicate with sound. There are plants that are pollinated by bats that have acoustic beacons. And sometimes this is a flower petal, or sometimes it's a leaf. And basically it has this certain shape. And when the bat-pollinated flower is ready to be pollinated, this little structure will pop up. And what it looks like from the bat's point of view is it's flying through a cluttered rainforest, and then suddenly there's something really loud right there in the cluster of these flowers, and that's the flower ready to be pollinated. So you can think about this as like a little bright light, except it's acoustic for bats. And there's a number of plants that actually have these. And it's amazing because if you simulate a bat echolocating across the flower, this thing just pops out in this really dramatic way. So the fact that bats have so many different kinds of echolocation and different strategies for echolocation is one of the reasons that they look so weird. And the morphological diversity of bats is just one of these things that we've been studying for a long time, and it's still not completely understood. So you see bats have these things called horseshoes on their face, which they are sending the sound out through here. This bat has what's called a nose leaf that's almost as big as its huge ears. Why do they have these things? Well, we know they're involved with echolocation, but we don't understand the mechanics of it. A lot of people are studying this to try to make better antennas and signal transmitting devices. But this is all just complete mystery. I mean, look at this. This is the ghost face bat. Tiny little ears. Its whole face is like a megaphone. What's going on here with these structures? Are they causing some kind of resonance? We don't know, but active area of research. What we do know is that bats have different strategies for different places that they hunt. So if you go down to Panama, where I study bats, you have some bats that are foraging up above the canopy, and they have special kinds of calls that go really far but aren't so good at dealing with clutter, whereas a whole bunch of other bats, these ones that have these leaf noses, these leaf nose bats, hunt in the thick canopy and have much quieter calls that are much higher resolution. And so we can record these, and we can tell what species are flying around. We can also tell what they're doing. So are they hunting? Are they catching insects? Are they making social calls to each other? We now have microphones that we can put on the bats. So we have microphones and GPS that both we can glue on the back of a bat. And as it flies around, we know what it's doing and how it's behaving. Not all bats echolocate. This is a gray-headed flying fox. It has really big eyes, really small ears. This entire group of bats lost the ability to echolocate. They started roosting in the open canopy of trees, and they have excellent vision, excellent smell, but no special sonar. That's not completely true. Actually, some of them re-evolved echolocation because they moved back into caves, and then it became useful to be able to see in absolute darkness again, and they came up with a new form of echolocation that's totally different that involves clicking your tongue. And they actually do this through the side of their mouth, so these bats that are smiling all the time are actually clicking through the left and the right. And so they're going click, click, click. And what they do is when they're beaming on a target, they sort of shift back and forth. And that allows them to position something in front of them in much the same way that a dog sniffs back and forth like this. They click out of both sides of their mouth. And this is also what humans can do. So if you're a blind human, you can learn to echolocate by clicking. And there's schools now that teach people how to do this. And if you go on YouTube, you can find videos of like blind people shooting basketball hoops and doing amazing things you wouldn't believe because they can echolocate. And that's through tongue clicking. Okay, so there's this guy named Edwin Gould who is a crazy old man that used to study bats and retired and actually started the farm that my wife started working at. And he was like a hero of mine, and I thought he was long dead because he had studied bats with Donald Griffin back in the 1940s. But he's still around. And he had all these crazy ideas, and one of them was he discovered these bats in Malaysia where he thought, well, he didn't discover them, but he discovered this behavior where they were living deep down in these caves, and he heard these clicks, and he saw they weren't clicking with their tongues. And he had published this paper called, I think it was like Echolocation by Wing Clapping. And everyone read this paper and thought, this is the dumbest thing I've ever heard. Like, nobody believed this paper, because the idea is like the bat's clapping, and then that's what it's using to echolocate, but only when it's like way back in these caves, and that's why you don't hear it clapping all the time. Everyone's like, yeah, okay. So somebody went to study this, and they went there to disprove that, to show that, well, they're actually clicking with their tongues, and here's how it works, and here's why that's not really true, but it turns out that it is true. And I went and actually tried to replicate the study, and it's really difficult because the bat's eyesight is so good that even a tiny light, like this light that the speaker's making, the bat could fly around in the room just fine using that amount of light. So you have to make absolute darkness, and then when you make absolute darkness, they start clicking their wings. But their echolocation's terrible. So this is the bat, and the size of that object in front of it, it's like object like this, almost a meter by a meter. That's about the size of something that they could see with their echolocation. So they are, in fact, clicking their wings, but they have really low resolution echolocation, which allows them to not crash into a wall, but it's kind of on the way to being what these tongue-clicking bats can do. But that's 3 different ways that echolocation has evolved in bats. And also, some bats have changed the way they echolocate, and they use Doppler shift rather than these changes in frequency. But that's a little technical. I won't talk about that now. Okay, bats have big ears not only for echolocating, but also because they have really amazing hearing, and they hunt by listening to their prey. So they can hear the footsteps of insects. This is a frog-eating bat that learns all of the frog calls in the forest, and then uses those frog calls to decide which frogs to feed on, because some of them are poisonous or some of them are not. And they have these little warts you see around their mouth, and that's to detect whether or not the frog's poisonous. But once they learn, then they use the sounds of the frogs. And my postdoc advisor, Rachel Page, took advantage of this and basically realized that she could sort of study learning in bats and how bats learn and the ecology of learning in this mammal. And so she caught all these bats around Panama and repeatedly captured them, and she trained them on all these weird sounds like Bob Marley song, or like ring of a cell phone, or little clips of music. And so she had rewarded all these bats and taught them, okay, when you hear Jimi Hendrix guitar, that means you're going to get a frog to eat. And what she found is that they're amazingly good at remembering these calls. So they can train them on a sound, and then go out in the forest and play that sound, and there comes like Barney the Bat from like years ago, who's like, where's my food? Like, I hear Jimi Hendrix. And so they're able to track these bats over years and show that they remember these things. And what's more amazing is that bats, they actually can learn from each other. So she wouldn't train some bats. She would just put them in the cage with these ones, and the Jimi Hendrix bat that goes down and gets the Jimi Hendrix treat every time he hears the Jimi Hendrix song is being watched by the other bat, and suddenly this bat can learn from that bat. And she created these chains of transmission showing that you can get kind of this social learning going on from individual to individual. And then later, it was shown that this can occur across species. So there's another bat that feeds on katydids, and it can also learn from this species as well. Another thing that people are studying is song in bats. So bats produce really complex songs. It's completely understudied compared to birds, but they have these complex songs just like songbirds do, and the young bats even begin to babble. So they kind of just combine these syllables in random ways in much the same way that human infants babble. This is another active area of research. This is a bat that makes a song that is very low frequency, and so its whole face is distorted so it can produce these really low frequency calls. These are honking fruit bats. Okay, so I study vampire bats, and what's interesting about vampire bats is they have these really complicated social lives where they have a network of different relationships, and females have these cooperative relationships they form with each other where they groom each other, and they also share food with each other. And the way we measure these relationships is we fast a bat, we make it hungry by fasting overnight. They feed on nothing but blood, so we don't let them feed on blood that night. Other bats will come, start grooming them, and then they'll regurgitate blood to feed them. And they don't just do this so all the mothers do this for their kids, but they also do this for their kids when the kids grow up. And females do this for other adult females, and it's not just between relatives, it's also between non-relatives. And the best predictor of how much one bat feeds another is how much that bat has fed you in the past. So it seems that they are nepotistic, but they seem to perform reciprocity, helping individuals that have helped them before. And one of the ways that they maintain these relationships is through sound, and this is important because in the wild, these bats are flying all around and switching roosts all the time. They don't live in stable aggregations. They're constantly moving around. And sometimes they might need to find other individuals, and they do this through sound. And here's an example where we showed this. So we trapped a bat inside of a little cage and put it on the ground, and it would call, and then its food donors would come down and feed it through the cage bars. And I was actually the first person to show that bats actually recognize each other, and I did that as recently as 2008, which shows you how far behind we are when it comes to understanding communication in bats. And I basically adopted an experiment that was designed for human infants, and the way the experiment works is that I just put a bat inside of this pencil case, and I'm playing it calls, all different calls from one individual. So these are different calls, but all from the same bat. And what I haven't shown you here is I've been playing these calls to this bat for quite a long time, to the point where it no longer cares anymore, and it's habituated. And now we're gonna just keep everything else the same, but we switch the identity of the bat, and what you're gonna see is the bat matches every single call. And see that in a moment. So I think it's asleep now. I don't know, can you guys hear that? A lot of times when I play this, it's the older people in the audience are like, I don't hear anything. It's very high frequency. So you can see it matches all the calls of one bat and not the other. And that shows that this individual recognizes this other individual. There's other species of bats that make calls that they can't, they're not individual signatures to the calls. So the calls are not individually distinct. But what happens instead is they join a group. This is a group of unrelated female bats. And they all just form this group sort of spontaneously. And then they synchronize their reproduction. They're guarded by this male down here. And the really amazing thing is that they shift all of their calls to be the same call. And they can't tell each other apart as individuals. They only know whether you're in my group or you're not in my group. And what's really important about these groups is that they're also pretty cooperative. They raise the young together all at the same time. Females from other groups will come and try to eat the pups from this group. And the mothers will rescue the pup, obviously, if they're there. But if the mother isn't there, other females in the same group will go down and guard that pup from other groups. So there's this kind of within-group cooperation and between-group competition between these bats. And it's all mediated by these group signature calls. And that's all I have for you. If you guys have any questions, I'd be happy to take them. Thanks.